Hello again. Welcome to the class, sort of the second module, B, we could call it the second half of the March 5th class where we started to review and then never got past the review. So today I want to talk a bit about postmodernism, return to organizational theory and postmodernism. I want to have you to take time to work together in your assigned working groups, because in class tomorrow you'll be presenting, and so everybody needs to be there. No excuses, you need to be there, and we need to have you present from your working groups presentations 1 and 2. So please be prepared for that. So let's talk about postmodernism more specifically. I'll give you some background on that before we talk about organizational theory in particular. So I'll just give you a brief overview of postmodernism now. As the name suggests, it comes after modernism, postmodernism. But its substance and character is highly debated and contested. Even the people who would describe themselves as postmodernists disagree on what that means. But let's kind of pick this apart a little bit. It is first and foremost a reaction to modernism. It's a reaction to modernism. And if you think about the machine metaphor of modernism, Corbusier calling architecture, we're designing living machines, that kind of thing, the control, the efficiency, the scientific rationality going into all of the things that we were creating in the new modern industrial world, that's what it's reacting against. It's against control and efficiency as the highest value, the highest norm. So it's kind of anti-engineering in that regard. It's against the dehumanizing nature of modern power, warfare. I mean, think about, again, Nazi Germany or the atomic bomb and the efficiencies, the technological efficiency of destroying something. That's a modernist concept of war, total control, total domination. That's a metaphor with its rigid structure and emphasis on power. Okay. So in that respect, postmodernism is a protest movement against modernity, but it's kind of within modernity as well. It's a cultural formation in a moment, more or less, of coherent assumptions and beliefs, practices, symbols, and so on that gives it a character. I mean, there are certain moments in history where you could say, there was this moment of the sort of Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance and Reformation come along, and while they're on the same timeline, there's something important that changes at those moments. And I think that the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century is a really important period of unsettling of things. So World War I, the Great War, was considered the war to end all wars. And its brutality, the use of chemical weapons and just the mass killing of people, it was just horrific. And all of the sort of golden age ideas coming out of the 19th century, where you're just making more and more progress, was kind of killed with the war. I mean, it just wiped that out as a kind of concept that people could really trust and believe. And they questioned their own values. Do we believe the right things? So that unsettling period begins kind of two tracks. The modernist track continues with the growth in scientific rationality, again, typified by sort of Nazi Germany's approach to warfare and eventually the atomic bomb in the United States as one of the scientific modernist directions. And the other is what we could call a sort of linguistic turn. Okay, and I'll say more about that in a second. Let me just digress here for a moment. Modernity has had its opponents for a long time. Not everybody has been enchanted with modernity, and probably one of the most important movements in the late 19th century against modernity was Romanticism, and that showed up in art, the sort of breaking away from the rigid realism of the art to things like Impressionism and abstract expressionism, and those sorts of things became kind of anti-rationality and control. It was more showing the emotions, the humanness. So Romanticism exalted intuition, imagination, stressed emotion, your emotional reactions, your feelings. They said, hey, isn't part of human life emotional? Isn't there a feeling that you have, not just a rational, rigid idea of how something should be structured and controlled? And so Romanticism is an anti-modern view. And in that respect, postmodernism is kind of anti-modern, but it actually is trying to move past both being anti-modern and modern, as if those were the two options, and really saying, the issues that were raised by modernism and the reactions against them were part of a system that postmodernism is trying to move beyond. So it's sort of like saying if you have two political parties and they just fight each other all the time, Republicans and Democrats, or socialists and Democrats, pick your dual parties. Those two things are not necessarily the only options. Every once in a while, there's a third option or a third way. And while these two seem to have it's either or, they're going, no, there's another way to go completely. It's not what you two guys fighting it out. Let's try this one over here. And all of a sudden it breaks the paradigm of the two. That's kind of what postmodern is trying to do. It's not just wanting to be modern or anti-modern, it's trying to be beyond modern, beyond that whole debate. So it's kind of a concept of change that way. Postmodernism is an extension of the linguistic turn in modernist philosophy in many ways. The modernists trying to perfect language tried to reduce it to mathematics. Okay, when we talked earlier about language, they were trying to deal with this question of how do you deal with the fluidity of language and the vast semantic range that terms have and so on. They wanted to make it precise. They wanted to have a control of language, so when I said the word run, it meant this and only this, and I could give that a 1, and then if I used a different word, then that could be a 2, and we could mathematically make language precise. That is something like Whitehead and Wittgenstein and some of these guys all tried to come up with a sort of mathematical precision, Carnap. And it failed. It failed miserably, and they realized that because language is not something that you can pin down. It's much more like a vapor, a cloud. It changes constantly, and it changes across time and across people groups and so on. So it's not just a fixed box where you can put the definition in. It's constantly changing. And so that fluidity, that flexibility is kind of what postmoderns began to realize, is that the whole modernist exercise, the attempt at controlling even language, was going to be impossible. And so what they recognized was language is power. To choose your words, to label something, there's a power inherent in that. And they looked more at the power of language and what was going on. And that's partly why in postmodern political correctness, you'll see things like, you can't use certain terms. You can't say that. The current one right now is President Trump saying the China virus. Well, all the postmodern politically correct folks are flipping out because that's somehow racist to say that. Well, says who? I mean, is he hating Chinese? No, he's simply using a term. But they're saying he's trying to control the narrative. He's trying to control the power over American people to think about the Chinese as bad, virus spreading bad people. Now, that's an interpretation, but it gets you into this language problem of what words can we use. And so certain words become suddenly more problematic. And just as an aside, this is where it kind of comes around, right? People almost become totalitarian. You can't say that word. That's a bad word. Words in our language differ across cultures, but you can probably think of a word that could be said about someone that's really degrading, and you just can't use that in polite company anymore. Or if you use it, you have to put it in quotes, where I'm only talking about the word. I'm not saying you are this, I'm just talking about the word. So that kind of emphasis on language and political correctness is very, very important. A couple other things. Postmodernism has tried to change the styles, the moods, and the structures of politics, culture, economics, and society. And you can see this to some degree in architecture. So postmodern architecture kind of plays with some of the historical things and makes fun of them. They're kind of metaphorically interpreted, and so they're not just boxes, they're something else. And so you have all kinds of like Frank Gehry's very sort of look like crushed tin can approach to architecture, where he creates a shape, and then people just figure out how to do something inside of it. They start with a shape, and because of the new technologies that we have to create metallic surfaces and so on, they can create any shape they can imagine, and then they can turn that into a useful space inside for whoever owns it, a museum or a company or something. So like the Bilbao Museum, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, or the architecture, or the Seattle Museum to Rock and Roll is another Gehry Look it up, Frank Gehry's architecture, if you're not familiar with it. Also with video and film, we have the same kind of thing where it's much more handheld and in your face and doing different things rather than cuts and staging and putting everything square. And even social media is an interesting turn to the old top-down media of direct communication of a centralized speaker to a mass audience. Now that social media is all over the place and everybody's creating their own. And so in all of those ways, we see the changes arising from, in a sense, the effects of modernity, these tools that were created kind of out of the modern world. A cell phone is such a thing. It's a tool of modernity. And at the same time, it allows us to do things that are not so controlled and structured as they once were. So for businesses and organization, postmodernism kind of is obsessed with the problem of power and control and about language, how we call things what they are, and the organizational structure, even down to things like job descriptions. So if you want a more fluid organization, you're going to want something that is highly flexible, highly adaptable to change. It doesn't put you in a box. A job description, this is interesting, a job description will tell you you are supposed to do these tasks. You're supposed to fulfill these functions. Well, the postmodern organization wants to say, you're a human being. You're going to run into things and you're going to want to be flexible, and maybe you're going to do it this way, and maybe you'll use your skills in this area instead of that area, and you might be moving around a lot because it's not just about performing a function, it's about getting the best out of you as a person to help our goal together. And so we don't want to put you in a box. We don't want to say you must only do these things and you can't get outside your box. We want you to be able to get out of your box when you can contribute. And if you can contribute over here, great. Who cares about the box? The box is an artificial construct. Okay, one last thing. If we look at the key features of modernism, things like consumerism, industrialization, nationalism, pop culture, postmodernism seeks to either intensify those things in some way, to call attention to them more, invert them, turn them on their heads, unmask them, reveal them for what they are, attempt at power and control, for example, to dismantle certain things, to tear down certain structures. This is where the term deconstruct, sort of break down the language so that you're looking at what really is going on and what's the meaning underneath the words. And it's all toward the goal of having something more humane and flexible. So modernity's metaphors were mechanical, scientific, after the sort of atomized analysis in every detail and structure. And postmodernism looks at organic metaphors, flexibility, fluidity, tries to look at something more holistically, understand it, not just analyze it, and ultimately to have some kind of more humaneness. Now, does it do that? Does it achieve those goals? That remains to be seen. But we'll come back to that in the next video. So, see you again soon.